Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the fifth and final lecture in our present series, which is to do with what is wrong with the world. I've looked at different religions, I've looked at different heresies which have grown out of Christianity, but today, to conclude, I want to look at something rather different, and that is the whole question of atheism. In many ways, atheism is a more important subject today than many other things. You get deviations from Christianity, Christian Science and so on, which attract a small number of people. You get other world religions like Islam, which challenge Christianity in many important ways. But atheism is one of the most powerful ideologies in our modern society. It is a belief or lack of belief which has affected politics, it has affected culture, it appears in many different forms. You see, some people will say that communist countries like China and so on are officially atheist, and will equate these two things. They say, well, that's atheism. You have it as an official belief. But there are other countries where religion is tolerated, where different religious beliefs are tolerated, like America, for example, and like Europe, but where the governing belief, the governing ideology, is in fact atheistic. It may not say so in so many words. I mean, it may not be officially proclaimed as such, but in reality, that is what it amounts to. Religion is taken out of the society and is not replaced with anything else. So you end up with a practical form of atheism, even if it is not dogmatically asserted as the state belief. Well, what is atheism? How do we define it? This is an interesting question because atheism has meant different things to different people at different times in history. Modern atheism often looks back to the philosophies of ancient Greece as a source of inspiration, particularly Plato, but not just him, but other philosophers as well. And although it recognizes, of course, that Plato was not an atheist in the modern sense of the word, nevertheless they see in that philosophy and in that belief seeds that were planted that have grown into the atheism which we see today. And they will point, for example, to the hero of Plato's teaching, who was his own teacher, Socrates. Socrates did not write anything himself. It was Plato, his disciple, who did that. But Plato purported to convey, to interpret the teaching of Socrates, and Socrates was put to death. He was forced to commit suicide because he was accused of atheism. And so, ever since then, Socrates has been a kind of model, a kind of martyr for the cause of atheism. And he is honored even today for this reason, that he is the pioneer, if you like, in the struggle against religion. Well, was Socrates an atheist? Was the accusation brought against him justified? In the context of his time, the people of his time, I think the answer has to be yes. To the people who sat in judgment over him, he was an atheist. Why was he an atheist? Well, he was an atheist because he rejected the pagan gods of ancient Athens. He lived in a society where there were many gods were worshipped, where the gods fought each other, where they contradicted each other. You didn't really know when you were dealing with the gods who exactly you were dealing with. It was a very complex and difficult situation. And Socrates, who had a very logical and rational mind, said, this does not make sense. You can't have all these competing deities. It just can't work like that. Furthermore, of course, Socrates understood that the gods whom people worshipped were highly immoral in practice. The gods not only deceived people, but they killed people whom they didn't like. They tried to kill each other. It was a very unhappy and very unpleasant society that they had created, or the mythology, which explained what they were, had created on their behalf. So Socrates realized this, and he rejected it. What did he believe? Well, he believed that he had an inner voice, something inside him which spoke, which spoke the truth. Now, it's very difficult for us to say what this inner voice was, or how we would understand this now. Perhaps the closest we can come to this is to say that it is what we would call the conscience. There's something inside us which knows the difference between right and wrong, which speaks to us when it is necessary to make decisions of a moral nature, and which guide us in this way. That is perhaps as close as we can come to this inner spirit, this inner voice, which Socrates claimed guided him. Now, if we accept that, we accept that this is what he believed, then of course he was not an atheist in the modern sense. Modern people, modern atheists may believe in conscience. Yes, they may have this, but they don't think of this as a divine power. Socrates did. He thought that there was something divine, there was something godlike in this voice which spoke to him. So strictly speaking, from a modern point of view, he would not be an atheist as we would define this now. But in his own context, he was, because atheism to him, or to his society, was denial of the pagan gods. In this respect, of course, Christians were atheists. And it may come as a surprise to you to discover this, but the early Christians, the Christians in the early church, were accused of this. You see, they were accused of atheism because they did not worship the gods. They said the gods were false. And you see this in the career of the Apostle Paul. When the Apostle Paul went to Ephesus, for example, his preaching and teaching started a riot in the city because the people who ran the temples, the pagan temples, the people who made idols, little idols that they would sell to people as items to worship, they saw their business declining. People were no longer buying these things, and they said, well, why not? Well, because here's this man, this Paul, who's come along and is telling us that this is all false, it's not true. He and his followers, these are atheists. They don't accept the gods. So, of course, their understanding, the understanding of the Ephesians, was similar to the understanding of the Athenians in their attack on Socrates. That it was denial of the pagan gods that made them atheists. The difference, of course, is that whereas Socrates did not have anything very concrete or anything very evident to put in place of the pagan gods, he had this inner voice. But did other people have this inner voice? Was it the same inner voice? Was there one inner voice that spoke to everybody in the same way, or was it something peculiar to him? This he never really answered. You see, and of course people said, well, that's fine for you. You think this, but you are actually putting yourself out of society. You are claiming a special position. You are not one of us because you have this peculiar and unique source of knowledge, source of information that you are following. So we can't accept that. But Paul did not say this. Paul said, no, there is a God. This God is not my inner voice speaking to you. He is not someone I control. He is someone I know. I know because I have believed in his Son, Jesus Christ. I have seen and heard the message proclaimed to me. And this is the God who has created the heavens and the earth. The reason the pagan gods are false is not so much because they contradict each other or because they are immoral, but rather because there is a universe which has been made by a single mind, by a single God, who has then come to reveal himself in Jesus Christ. So Paul does not hold up himself as the source of knowledge, you see, as the source of spiritual enlightenment or anything like this. He preaches the scriptures, the Bible, and the teaching and life of Jesus Christ. That they are to look to him and to his teaching as the revelation of God, and that this is valid for all people. It's not, you don't have to go to one particular philosopher or one particular prophet or one particular priest in order to get the truth. You can have the truth because Jesus Christ sends his Holy Spirit to dwell in your heart by faith. So there is this common belief, there's this common teaching. So in this sense, of course, the early Christians were not atheists. They were proclaimers of the one true God. And they were clear about this, and therefore their attack on paganism, on the pagan gods, was more credible because they had something better to put in its place. And for hundreds of years after that, atheism basically disappeared. The word was not used, the concept was abandoned by most people. There may have been the odd one here or there who did accept it, but on the whole, it was no longer very influential. But then there came a time in the 15th and 16th centuries when atheism reappeared. You find this at the time of the Protestant Reformation, perhaps somewhat surprisingly. Of course, the Reformers were not atheists. On the contrary, they were proclaimers of the true God and the worship of the true God. But they denounced people who were atheists. There's quite a lot in their writings and their teachings and so on, contradicting or attacking atheism. But what did they mean by atheism? They did not mean what we mean today by this. To somebody like Martin Luther or John Calvin, an atheist was somebody who disobeyed the law of God, who ignored the law of God, who lived a sinful life and did not care. You see, maybe he thought there was a God up there in heaven somewhere, but he was quite happy to disobey. He was quite happy to ignore this God. He was not going to listen to the teaching. He was not going to change his life in order to conform to the will of God. This was the atheist. You see, that the atheist who lived a sinful life that contradicted what he should have known was what God wanted. Now, this is not atheism in the modern sense, not at all. These people who lived in this way in the 16th century were relatively few and far between, and they were known by their behavior. See, somebody who drank too much, somebody who indulged in sexual immorality, that kind of thing. These were atheists, you see, because they were ignoring the teaching which they should have known was true. They just didn't care about it. Modern atheism is a different thing altogether. Modern atheism begins really in the 17th century, and it is a philosophical position which says that there is no supernatural being. Supernatural beings do not exist, and above all, God does not exist. To this kind of person, all religion is essentially false. It's false because it is talking about something that isn't there, something that just does not exist. Now, how did this come into being? Where did this come from? Partly it came about because of the fallout, the results of the Reformation in the 16th century. You see, when Martin Luther and John Calvin began to preach and to spread their teaching, they believed that they were trying to reform the church, that they were the church of their time had fallen into corruption, and that they had discovered in the Bible the key to putting that right, the key to getting back to the true message which God had given to his people and that was recorded for us in the Bible. Now, in principle, of course, you can see what they were doing. In practice, the difficulty came that many of these people, many of the reformers, disagreed with each other about what God really wanted. Now, this has to be understood in the context of the time. Nobody questioned things like the doctrine of the Trinity or the work of Christ on the cross. These things were generally agreed by most people. Where the disagreements came were over questions that the Bible is not clear about. You see, things like, for example, the way the church should be governed. What kind of church should you have? Should you have bishops in your church? Should you have elders in your church? How do you choose your elders? How do you elect these people? You see, what kind of principles do you need to observe in order to have a pure church? You see, in order to have the church that God wants to exist on earth. Well, people disagreed about this. And in some ways, they still disagree about this. Why do they disagree about this? Well, they disagree because the Bible does not clearly state that one view is true in a way that others are false. Now, the difficulty here is that everybody who holds these different positions, different points of view, can find something in the New Testament to support their belief. So that you can find, for example, instances where the church obeys the teaching of one person. And so, like the apostle, for instance. So you can say, well, this is a model for us. This is why we have bishops. You see, a bishop is the head of a local church, and he takes the place of an apostle. Then you will have other churches where it seems that the government of the church was divided. It was shared among different people, different elders, and they operated. Who chose these elders? Initially it seems to have been the apostles themselves who chose the elders. Then we are told that the Apostle Paul appointed Timothy and Titus and told them to appoint elders, and so they did it. But how it sort of carried on, whether they were elected or who decided who was going to be an elder, was not clarified, you see, not sufficiently in the New Testament. So there was room for disagreement on these things. Unfortunately, people who held these views were not prepared to accept that other people might think differently from them. They believed that the Bible said everything that had to be said, that their particular view was the true view, and they tried to defend it on the basis of texts, of biblical texts, which really were not sufficiently clear to support them. And for this reason, the reformers, Protestants, fell out with each other. You see, they couldn't agree on one way forward, on one system. And in this context, there were people who stood back from this, and they said, this cannot be right. This does not make sense. If there is only one truth, if there is only one God, then these different opinions, these different points of view, cannot all be equally right. You see, you can't say this. Those who claim that you can, who say that I'm right and you're wrong, where the other person, using the same basic information, the same basic Bible, says the opposite. This cannot be true. People are fighting each other. They are dividing the church. They are dividing society on the basis of beliefs which cannot be proved, which cannot be demonstrated to be true by any logical criterion. And so these people began to question. They began to say, well, is the Bible a revelation from God? Is there a God who does this? Is this not just the imagination of people who want to believe that there is a God? You see, who want to say these things, but there is no evidence to support them. It was a time in human history when what we call today the sciences, the natural sciences, were starting to develop. And unfortunately, the churches of the time were tied to a view of scientific things that was false. They had accepted the science of the ancient world, of Plato, of Aristotle in particular, in Greece. The scientists of the 16th and 17th century, by their experiments, by their testing of things, by trying it out, you see, by trial and error, were demonstrating that the ancient wisdom was false. The ancient wisdom, which had been built on speculation, on ideas, not on experiment, could no longer be followed. And because of this, you see, for example, a clear example, the belief that the sun revolves around the earth, not the other way round, people who said this, you see, who said that the sun is at the center and we circulate round the sun, they were accused of heresy. They were accused of going against the revelation of God, even though God had never said anything like that. You see, they identified with this ancient philosophy with revelation, with the truth as such. And as scientific developments occurred and people began to realize that this teaching was wrong, it was too primitive, they said, well, if this is wrong, this is what the church has been teaching as true, even though there was no real basis for this. You see, it was just something that people had accepted over the years. Then we must reject it. We have to reject not only the false conclusions of ancient science, but also the authority of the church, which has decreed that these things are correct and that they must be accepted. There was, of course, the very famous belief of so-called transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is a doctrine of the Catholic Church which says that when the priest takes the bread and the wine at Holy Communion and he prays over them, then this bread becomes the body of Christ and the wine becomes the blood of Christ. From a scientific point of view, of course, this is complete nonsense. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. And yet it was the official teaching of the Church. It still is the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. But in the 16th century and in the 17th century, if you denied that teaching, if you said, no, it cannot be, you could be put to death for this. You see, there were people who were killed because they said what is obviously true, which is that bread and wine do not change. You cannot change them by prayer. By the prayer of a priest, it's not going to make any difference. And so once scientists began to see, that this kind of thing is impossible, that this belief is based on something false, they threw out everything. They said, no, we're not going to accept any of this. It's got to be all wrong. And it was on that basis that atheism, as we understand it, came into being. It was the rejection of a false form of Christianity. Now, it's important to say this because modern atheism really only makes sense in a Christian context. Modern atheists are not people who deny the existence of pagan gods. We all deny the existence of pagan gods. If that's the criterion, if that's the basis, then everybody is an atheist, even if you are religious, a person. So it's not that. Atheism is a rejection of the Christian doctrine of God, of Christian belief, of the biblical teaching. It denies that there is a revelation. It says there is no being who speaks to us from outside the world in which we live. The only source of knowledge, the only source of truth comes from our own human reason, the way we think, you see, and this must be the criterion. If something makes sense, if it is logical, if it can be demonstrated to be true in scientific terms, then it can be accepted. If it cannot be demonstrated in scientific terms, then it must be rejected as false. Now, if you hold that belief, or something like it, then atheism in the modern sense becomes understandable. You can see why people think this. Because as Christians we have to agree that the truth of our faith cannot be demonstrated by scientific means. Now, I am not saying that science disproves the existence of God, that by taking scientific experiments you can prove there is no God. You cannot do that because you cannot prove a negative. I mean, that doesn't work. But you cannot prove that there is a God. You see, this is a matter of faith and belief. It may be logical belief. You may have good reasons for believing this, but you cannot ultimately prove it. You can't find God and examine him, you see, and put him under the microscope and say, well, this is God, and this is how we define. So if this is the criterion that you are using, then it won't work. And of course, Christians have never claimed anything like this. You see, Christians have always said it's the wrong way to go about it, because what we call the sciences, the natural sciences, are a way, they are a means of understanding the created order that we see around us, the material universe. For this purpose, they are valid and valuable. We need them to unearth or to uncover or to discover the secrets of matter, of the material world. But when it comes to spiritual things, science is useless. It's useless because it's not adapted for that purpose. Now, of course, scientists do not accept this, and the result is that you have a number of so-called sciences which have grown up, like psychology, for example, and so on, which may be valid within a material context, but which claim to deal with things that Christians would call spiritual, explaining them in what are essentially material terms. You see, in other words, the natural sciences try to invade the world of the spirit. They try to claim the world of the spirit for themselves. And therefore, of course, they are working on very dangerous and difficult ground, because you cannot demonstrate this to be objectively true. Who decides, for example, whether a person is psychologically normal? Most of us, I suppose, don't really ask this question most of the time. We accept it. There are some people who are clearly crazy, difficult people, but most of us, we tend to assume, well, you know, they may think a little bit differently from us in certain ways, but they are fundamentally normal. But what are you going to say to somebody who says that if you believe in the existence of a God, you are psychologically damaged. You are damaged, you are abnormal, because you are projecting your own feelings, your own complexes, your own difficulties onto a higher being, onto another being who does not really exist. You see, this is a complex, this is a problem. If this is what you think, then you are not normal. But is this true? You see, and this is a real question, because there are times when religious people have been put in psychiatric hospitals for this reason. You see, because they have religious beliefs, there must be something psychologically wrong with them. And so the issue is one that we have to deal with. This is a problem that we have to grapple with. But first of all, before we do this, we need to look at what the attractions of atheism are. Why would people become atheists? What satisfaction do they find in it? One thing, of course, is that to many people, religion appears to be hypocrisy. People look at religious believers and they say, they see the religious person saying one thing, doing another. You see, not consistent with their beliefs. Or they see religious people who seem to be indifferent to human suffering. They say, well, human beings have got to die, human suffering is natural, is normal, there isn't anything much we can do about it. Now, of course, as Christians, we would say this is a false perception. This is wrong. Yes, there are people who claim to be believers who behave in ways which are not consistent with their belief. But this is their problem. It doesn't mean that the belief itself is false. In fact, it may demonstrate the exact opposite. It may be that the belief is true, but that we are inadequate. We are unable to live up to it. We are unable to put it into practice. And in a way, this is what Christians say. The Christians say, yes, we don't live up to our principles. We do fail in this way. Why? Because we are sinners. You see, the concept of sin, which basically doesn't exist for an atheist. You see, you can't have that because sin is disobeying somebody, and if the somebody doesn't exist, how can you have sin? So this is how we would deal with this. You see, we are not impressed by this argument, but that is what people think. A lot of people think. Many atheists, as a result, are highly moral people. The Protestant reformers, as I say, thought of atheists as immoral. Or rather, they thought of immoral people as atheists. You see, that there was a connection there. But today we have to say that there are many atheistic people who are idealists. They believe in justice. They believe in freedom. They believe in prosperity for everybody. And indeed, if you question this, you see, if you say, well, do you really believe this? Is this really, what are you saying? They'll say, yes, religion is a barrier. You see, religion prevents these things from being realized. Religion promotes injustice. Religion promotes slavery in different ways. You see, because you are told to be submitted to one another, submitted to the higher powers or whatever. You see, it goes against this. Religion accepts poverty as a natural way of life and does not necessarily promote prosperity as we understand it. Now again, we have to say that this is a misunderstanding, particularly a misunderstanding of Christianity. No Christian would say that we don't believe in justice, for instance. Christians believe that we are free. We have a freedom. We have a freedom in Christ. We are not against prosperity. We don't think that prosperity is a god that we have to worship, but we don't say that enjoying the fruits of the earth is somehow wrong. No, we promote this. We promote well-being in many ways. But atheists will point to times and places where this has not been true, where various political forces have manipulated religious belief in order to oppress the poor and so on. They will find examples of this and hold them up and say, well, there you are. This is why religion must be rejected. Religion can lead to violence. And this is particularly true, of course, in Islam, as we have seen. And the only way to get rid of violence, the only way to have real peace, is to get rid of religion. You see, people are killing each other for a myth, for a fantasy. And this must be wrong, so take it out. You see, if you're going to have a just society, a morally based culture, then religion stands in the way. It is a problem. This, of course, helps to explain why atheism has had its greatest successes in places where religion can be shown to have been an agent of oppression. This was true in France in the 18th century. The French Revolution came about because the French state at that time had oppressed people like Protestants, for example. They were cut out of the society. There was no freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and the people who adopted this policy, who applied this policy, were themselves highly immoral, and often were exploiting the people for their own benefit. That is true. It was also true in Russia. The Russian Revolution objected to the way in which the church behaved at that time. In China, it's a rather different situation because China is an unusual example in that the push for atheism was not against a Christian society, a basically Christian society. It was against a society where there were many religious beliefs, many things mixed up together, but they all seemed to be against development, against progress, against science and so on in their different ways. They appeared to be just superstition. And so you can understand why people who wanted development, people who wanted progress of one kind or another were opposed to that. Now, atheism claims to base its beliefs on scientific facts, not on theories that cannot be proved. And of course, the existence of spirits, as I've already said, this cannot be proved in a scientific way. And so everything that goes beyond the material is, in principle, rejected. Modern atheism is materialistic. But atheists see themselves, see this as a form of freedom. That once you abandon metaphysical concepts and you are just dealing with matter, with material reality, then you can change it, you can transform it, because the matter is no longer subject to a higher power, but it is something that can be altered, it is something that can be developed in its own way. And we say, well, human beings can be set free. You see, they can be set free from superstition, they can be given the power, the courage, and the ability to develop their potential, their natural abilities, and the assumption is that if they do this, they will benefit the world in general. You see, this is the theory. This is what people say that they want. Now, I think we have to say that most atheists believe that these things justify their outlook. They believe that in moral terms they are justified. Many atheists have turned to that position out of anger. They are angry with the world as it exists. They are upset because they see injustice, they see poverty, they see things that nobody is wanting to do anything about. And in particular, religious people don't really seem to have any great responsibility for these things. Atheists recognize the existence of evil, and they want to eradicate it. They want to get rid of it. They believe that it's possible to do so. You see that if you pool your resources, if you direct your policies to eliminating these things, that you can do this and you will not be constrained, you will not be limited, you will not be blocked by beliefs which cannot be proved. This is the position that that atheists adopt. Now, what do Christians say about this? How can Christians approach this? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that we have many things in common with atheists. This is particularly true if you look at theorists like, say, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a Jewish man or came from a Jewish family which had become officially Christian. So he was brought up in a Christian environment with a Christian sense of value. And what he saw in his world was people who claimed to be Christians, people who made a profession of faith, but first of all, who did not practice what they believed, what they claimed to believe. They didn't live it out. And secondly, did not seem to think there was anything wrong with that. They didn't feel a tension, any problem. They should change their position, their point of view. So he was perhaps the clearest example of somebody who was angry, not just with the state of the world, but with the state of people who claimed to be believers, to Christian believers, who claimed they had the answer in salvation, but who were not prepared to put that answer into practice in their lives. So we need to understand that. We need to recognize that. And in many ways, we sympathize with this approach. However, we cannot stop there. First of all, the analysis that atheists make of the Christian church is false. Wherever Christians have gone for many centuries, they have taken with them education, they have taken with them medicine, and the idea that human life can be improved. They have taken with them certain beliefs about the nature of human beings, which contradicts practices like slavery, which had existed for centuries. Now, it may be true that the church was not always successful in promoting its beliefs. It was certainly true that at different times the church was trapped by the society in which it was living, and that Christian people who should have known better found themselves defending slavery and things like this. However, within the Christian revelation, within the Bible, within the Christian teaching, there was always a power, there was always a revelation, always a spiritual force at work which went against these things. And this is what we see, you see today, that true Christian people do not run away from the world. They don't ignore injustice. They don't ignore the problems that people have. They try to deal with them. You see, they believe that yes, we have to feed the hungry. We have to help the poor. We have to reach out to those who are in need of one kind or another. You see, we've always professed this in theory, and I think in the modern world, on the whole, we have done this in practice more than atheists are prepared to admit. What you see today is that it is Christian people, very often, who will go to places, go to parts of the world that are suffering, particularly after disasters, and they are immediately there with relief, with help for these things. They do not rely on a political system. They do not rely on the state. They believe that it comes from the heart. You see, that as Christians we must give from the heart, from our belief, and we actually do what we can to put into practice these principles that we share with the atheists, but that we are prepared to work with. The big difference, of course, is that we do not believe that these things that we do are going to solve the problems. We can help, yes. We can improve living conditions, yes. But these actions, these external actions, cannot change the heart of the human being, cannot operate in a spiritual way, because they are not spiritual in themselves. Giving people money does not make them better people. Giving people education does not make them better people either. You see, we have to recognize that the real problem that we face is a problem which goes beyond what we are capable of resolving. This doesn't mean to say that we do nothing, we sit and do nothing, but it does mean that if we are helping people escape from poverty, from ignorance, and so on, the best way to do this, the best way in the long term, is to proclaim the gospel message of Christ to them. The gospel message which will set them free from the spiritual tyranny in which they find themselves. And when we look at atheists in this respect, we say the trouble with atheists is that their view of life, their view of the problems of the world, is inadequate. They haven't understood the depths of human sinfulness. In fact, they haven't understood sinfulness at all, because sinfulness cannot exist when God does not exist. You see, if there's no God, there is no sin. And this simple belief, you see, is one that atheists find difficult to understand, and that Christians cannot accept. Ultimately, a Christian critique, a critique of atheism, is that atheism can only exist if there is a God to object to. It is a negative belief. It is a denial of something. And no lasting philosophy or religion can be based on a negative. As Christians, we object to sin. We want to deal with the problem of sin. Sin is the absence of good. It is the denial of what is good. But important as this is to us, the Christian faith is not based on sin. It's not because of sin that we are Christians. It is because of God that we are Christians. It is because of God's self-revelation in Christ that we are Christians. You see, and it is because of that we understand what sin is, and that we have the ability and the power to deal with it. So we don't ignore sin, but we put it in its context. We don't use that, you see, the rebellion against God as the basis of our belief. Atheism is the ultimate rebellion against God by denying that He exists. And here, of course, we have to say, you cannot do this. You see, you don't have to believe there is a God. Maybe you don't believe that. But how can you build a philosophy of life on that? Let me take an example which I've already mentioned, the existence of dragons. I do not believe that dragons exist. But my life is not governed by that belief, or by that lack of belief. I have not built a complete moral and philosophical system out of my conviction that there are no dragons. What would I do? What would I say? You see? And the Christian critique of atheism is that atheism wants everything that is good and right about Christianity. They want to take the best in Christianity, but they don't want the basic principle on which Christianity works. They don't want the basic belief which makes Christians the people that they are. So in a sense, you see, a good atheist is a kind of half-Christian, somebody who sees one aspect of Christianity, but thinks you can apply this without God. An interesting example, and here I will conclude, is that after the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, saw Christian people in Russia, mostly Protestants who had gone there, who lived in self-contained societies where they helped one another. They had a collective mentality, and they worked together to keep their communities going. And he saw that example, and it was from that example that he developed the idea of the collective farm. He said, well, if we put everybody together and they cooperate with each other, then we will have prosperity. The experiment with the collective farm was a disaster. It failed. It caused huge problems, widespread famine, and so on. Why? Because the spirit which animated the Protestants who put the collective resources together was missing. There was no commitment, you see, from the heart. There was no understanding. There was only a decree which said, do this and everything will work out. And the failure of this, you see, the inability of this, was because of the denial of the essentially spiritual nature of the human being. And this is ultimately the Christian critique of atheism. Atheism ignores the most important thing in life. And the most important thing in life is the Spirit of God, the Spirit which is put in us, which is the image and likeness of God in us. It's time for a break. We've come to the halfway point in this lecture, so I'm going to pause now and we'll come back for the second half in due course. Thank you very much. Welcome everybody again to the second and final part of this series of lectures. I've been talking in this fifth lecture about Christianity and atheism. And what I said at the conclusion of my last talk was two things, really. First of all, that in one way we have many things in common with atheists. We have many values that we share, but we object to atheism because we say that it is inadequate. By ignoring the spiritual dimension of life, it has ignored both the source of the problems that we have and the key to the answer to those problems. As Christians, we believe that it is only in spiritual terms that we can analyze the world in which we live, and that we can begin to deal with the problems that it has. Now, one of the problems that atheism has is that because it is in some ways a form of Platonism, it is descended from the Platonism of the ancient world, is that it tends to be idealistic. It creates ideas. It says that it is not spiritual, that it is not metaphysical, that it is purely material, but in fact it is not. There's a contradiction here, because an idea, of course, is not a material thing. An idea is a mental concept, and is therefore, in some sense, metaphysical. We could go into this in great detail, but I'm going to focus on just one aspect, one which I think is the most important that we see, and that is the concept of humanity. If you go around the world, you will see that in many places, atheist newspapers, journals, call themselves humanity, or they something like this. You see, they're talking about humanity as an idea, as a concept. They believe in the potential of humanity. They want to liberate humanity. They want humanity to develop in the way that it is supposedly meant to develop. The trouble is, humanity does not exist. There is no such thing. You cannot isolate this and say, well, this particular thing here, this is humanity. All we have are people. Lots of people, many, many people around the world. You see billions of people. And every person is unique. Every person is different. There is no model. There is no one person that you can point to and say, this person is the model human being. This is what a human being is supposed to be like. And everybody else must conform to this. Now, in some ways, of course, it would be easier if we could say that, if we could look at some particular person and say, well, this is the ideal, this is what we should be aiming for, we should all try to be like this. But because this is not possible, because there is no such person, we are left with a mental construct. We are left with an idea of what the ideal person should be like, not what the person is like. We can't find such a person, but we invent. You see, we say, well, this is what people ought to be like. Now, of course, the problem is that nobody is like this. This does not exist. And indeed, even atheists are forced to admit this. You see, if you have a philosophy in which there are classes of people, there are the ruling classes, the workers, the intellectuals, different types of classes of people, you are already saying that humanity is not united. That there are different kinds of human beings, and of course, in a highly developed atheistic approach to these things, you will find that these classes are fighting each other. In other words, the workers have to fight the bosses, fight the upper classes in order to bring about the revolution, which will resolve the tensions, the problems in society. of course, what we discover is that when this happens, a new class develops among the workers, and the whole process repeats itself. To believe that it is possible to reduce the human race to a single type, to a single kind of person, inevitably is going to introduce a tyranny. It has to be a tyranny because most people will not naturally conform to that model. It may look as if all the workers in a factory are basically the same, because we see them dressing the same way, they wear uniforms like soldiers in the army and so on, and to look at it from the outside, you can say to yourself, well, there is a mass of people together, they constitute one type of being. But the minute you get to know these people, of course, the minute you mix with them and involve yourself with them, you discover that this is not true at all. That even workers in a factory are individuals. They have their own desires, they have their own fears, they have their own abilities, and they have their own frustrations, their own problems. They cannot be just regarded as all the same. And if you try, if you say, well, this is the solution, do this, 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 and this, and everything will be fine, it doesn't work. Because the more freedom, if you give freedom to people, the first thing that will appear is their differences. If I am going to be free, I want to be free to do what I want to do, not what you tell me to do, not what you say is good for me, but what I think I want to do for myself. And so freedom produces a kind of individuality, individualism, and that is the opposite of a belief in humanity, in a common humanity, which everybody shares. Now, as Christians, of course, we believe in freedom, we believe in individual expression, but we are not individualists in the strict sense. We do not believe that we can exist on our own without others. The model for us is given in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where the Apostle Paul compares the church, compares the fellowship of the church to a body, a human body. And he says that each of us is a part of the body. And he says the eye cannot say to the hand, I do not need you. If you take an eye and a hand or an ear, they are in themselves totally different from each other. You would never confuse them with one another. But they must work together. They belong together in a bigger picture, in a bigger unity. And this is what we as Christians believe. You see, we believe that we can be individuals. I mean, let's say I am the hand. Well, I have an integrity. I have a reality, an existence as the hand. But and so I am an individual in that sense. But I need the rest of the body in order to function properly. And what is more, I need the rest of the body to be different from me. Because if the whole body were the hand, then it wouldn't function. You see, if the only way that I can relate to you is by making you like me, see, the same as me, having a common denominator, a common value system for everything, then nothing will happen. No function will be possible, because what we need is diversity functioning together. You see that the individual is honored and expected to be what he or she is in himself or herself, but there is a bigger picture, a bigger unity, which is the unity of the body, And this unity of the body is essentially a spiritual thing. It is not a physical thing. And this is the fallacy. You see, this is where the whole thing goes wrong, and where we have to be very careful about this. Now, as Christians, we criticize atheism for many different things. One of them is that atheists cannot explain what the origin and purpose of human life is. They may believe in evolution, biological evolution. All right, they accept that. But why are we here? Why is there a human race? Why do we exist? Where are we going? What is the purpose of our life? Where do our values come from? Why do I think that some things are right and other things are wrong? Can I not change these beliefs? Can I not say, well, it may be right to kill millions of people if these people cannot be integrated into the new society? And of course, this is what has happened, that atheists have in fact killed people for this reason, because they say you are not adaptable, you cannot be changed, you cannot be made to conform with our beliefs, with our way of life, and so you must be eliminated. And they see nothing wrong with this. You see, they invent terminology to describe this. They say people who are doing the right thing, who are heading in the right way, are called progressive. People who do not follow this are called reactionary. But on what basis? You see, to be reactionary or to be progressive implies that there is a road along which we are traveling. And the person who is reactionary is the person who looks back to where they have come from. The person who is progressive moves ahead to where we are going. But where are we going? And how do we know this? You see, who decides what progressive is and when we have got there? Now, it may be possible to do this in certain limited ways. So that, for example, we could say, well, giving people education is progressive. That it is better to have education than not to have education. So a reactionary person will be a person who refuses to give education to somebody, saying that's not necessary or it's not good or something, whereas the progressive person says it must be given. Now, of course, if that's the way you think, if you're thinking at that level, then Christians will probably agree with this. I mean, we are not against education. We want people to have education. We think it's a good thing to develop the potential that we have within us. But we don't see this as an end in itself. That to be educated is a gift. Yes, it's a gift from God, but it must be used for the right purposes. If my education merely teaches me to be a better and more skillful sinner than I was before, then it's very questionable as to whether it is worthwhile. And of course, this is precisely what has happened in many cases. You see that the so-called progress that we have made, the development that we have had, has not fundamentally changed anything. It has simply made sin more extensive, more serious, more subtle in some ways. You see that we can use the potential that we have developed to behave in ways that are wrong. And as Christians, we have to say this. We have to say that atheism does not know where it is going, does not understand why we should be going anywhere at all. Why not just stay where you are? Why develop? What is the purpose of this? When there is, if there is no God, if there is no meaning to reality in this way. And so we would say this. We also believe that atheism is self-contradictory. You see, on the one hand, atheists will say that they are following the laws of the universe, that the universe has within it laws, principles that we have to follow, that we have to understand, that we have to develop. We have to conform our thinking to the way in which the world is constructed. But why is the world constructed like that? Well, let's accept that it is. That there are scientific laws and so on. But where did they come from? And if you accept the view, as many people do today, that this is an accident, that it is really by random selection that the world has become what it is, that these scientific laws have formed themselves and been shaped, you see, by a series of events which have no particular cause, that they are it's random selection, you see, the survival of the fittest, or something like this. The fact of the matter is that there is no evidence to support this. The evidence that exists in most cases is that if you have a highly developed system, something which is functioning in a very complex way, somebody has created that. Somebody has made that. If you take the controlling power away, if you let it just run on its own, without any interference, without any attempt to control, it will fall apart. And in fact, the result of so-called randomness is probably chaos rather than order. We have never seen order develop on its own. Order is always put there by a mind which is doing this. Now, it's very interesting here, from a Christian point of view, to realize that the opening chapters of the book of Genesis in the Bible are not really a description of creation in the strict sense of the word. The creation is in the first verse. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. But then the next thing is, the earth was without form and was void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So the earth was there. You see, the earth was made, it was created, but it had no form. It had no shape. It was dark. There was nothing about it that was attractive or that meant anything. And then what the text describes God is doing is bringing order out of this chaos. You see, the so-called story of creation is really a story of organization, of how God put the different aspects of the world together in a way that would work, you see, that would produce a system that functions for the benefit of us, of human beings, that we have been placed in a world which is made and which has been adapted for our use. So there is a purpose in this, there is a principle in this. Yes, there are laws of the universe, but these laws have not come about by accident. They are not the process of random selection. They are the work of a God with a mind who has done this with a particular purpose in view, and we need to understand this. Going beyond that, as Christians we have to say that there are realities in life which are not material and which cannot be explained in purely material terms. And of course, the most important of these, and the one which binds us together more than any of the others, is love. What is love? Why does love exist? Love is not rational. You can't explain it like this. If you could, you see, if love were a rational thing, you would say, well, two objects, two things which are the same, which are similar, let's say like my two hands, I put them together and they will be in love with each other because they recognize themselves in each other. You see, they have a natural affinity. They have something which binds them together because they are the same, because they are similar in this way. But we all know that love as we see it in the world is not like that at all. At one level, we see people who fall in love with each other, but they are not at all similar. They're not like each other at all. And other people look at this and they say, how did that happen? What is it? How is it possible for this man to fall in love with this woman when they are so completely different? And you see, what brought them together? And of course, there may be many explanations for this, but logical similarity is not one of them. We know that you cannot produce love by computer. You can't just sit down and create a situation in which love will happen. It doesn't work like that. And yet, we know also that without love, the world would not exist. If we were not attracted to one another, you see, if a man was not attracted to a woman ever for any reason, the human race would cease to exist. It couldn't exist. So what brings them together? Well, I suppose you could say force. You could force people to come together like this, and occasionally that has been tried. Well, that has been tried. Arranged marriages and so on. We know about this, but very often it is not the case. You see, there is an attraction, and that which brings people together, which cannot be explained in purely material terms. In particular, what we see, and we see this especially with parents and children, parents can love their children even when the children disobey them, even when they don't particularly like their children. You might say to your child, there's something wrong with the child is not disciplined. You may be very critical of the child in many ways. So you don't particularly like them, but you love them. You love them because there's something deeper than just liking something. It's more than this. It's a bond which ties them together and which survives everything. There is a saying which says there are some children that only a mother can love. Now that may be an exaggeration in some ways, but it tells us of a truth. You see, that to love is not the same thing as to like. That is much deeper than that. It binds us together. Binds us together as a family. It binds us together as a society. And it cannot be explained by purely material considerations. Then, of course, along with love come a whole range of other things, our feelings, our imagination. Why do people have an imagination? Why, for example, do we make stories? Why do we write books about people who never existed? We create novels and so on. We try to invent non-existent worlds. We develop superstitions and beliefs in dragons and things like that. Now, I'm not saying that that is right or good or that we should be doing this, but the fact is that we do, and we can. And the world of the imagination is a very powerful thing, that art and music and culture generally would not exist without this. You see, the creative spirit. What is it that propels a composer to produce his music? What is it that propels a painter to produce his art? What is it that propels a writer to produce his poetry, and so on? Is this logical? Does this come out of a material view of life? Well, no, it doesn't, you see, because the good musician, the good painter, the good writer sees into his subject. He sees something which the average person cannot see. He brings out from his subject a depth of perception, a depth of understanding, which would not otherwise be visible. You see this perhaps particularly with painting. That if you paint the portrait of another person, the painter will paint in a way to bring out certain characteristics of that person, which are there, which maybe can be perceived, but which are not so obvious. For example, if you just take a photograph. Now, there are other people, of course, who photograph their subjects, and they can bring out characteristics by the kind of photograph that they take. I mean, photography can also be an art form, and very often is. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is a deeper perception at work here. There's something that goes beyond what is immediately visible and immediately obvious. And we see this perhaps most clearly when we look at industrial cities which have been built on essentially atheistic principles. And the one thing you have to say about these places is that they are very ugly. They are soul-destroying. They are built out of concrete according to a master plan. There is no individuality. There is no life. It's as if you are building a huge prison, and nobody thinks, you see, to put a human touch. There's no, it may be mathematically correct and ordered in a mathematical way, but there is no beauty. There is no feeling, there is no warmth, there is no attraction to these things. And so we walk through these places, and they exist all over the world, not just in one country or another, but you can find them almost anywhere. And we feel that the place is dead, that there is something that is missing. And that something is of spiritual origin. You see, it may not be the spirit in itself, but it is something which comes from a spiritual perception, which allows for things like beauty, which has a concept of beauty, a concept of meaning, which goes beyond what is there on the surface. And as Christians, we look at atheism and we say, this is what is missing. This is what is not there in the atheistic perception of life. And this is why we object to it, you see, why we don't like it. And we say that as Christians, we have an answer which goes beyond this. We have something that takes us further than this. Now, moving on in our discussion of atheism, what about the future? You see, where is this going? We know that atheism developed in the 19th century. It became a strong intellectual and political force. That it dominated the 20th century. It seems to rule the world at the present time, and the whole world, that even in countries like America and in Europe, to be an atheist is perfectly acceptable. In fact, it is what is expected of intellectual people. The more intellectual you are, the more atheistic you will probably be. That seems to be the assumption. But this assumption needs to be questioned. It needs to be questioned in very specific ways. And Christians can do this because as Christians we believe in the future. You see, I've already said that many religions focus on the past. They focus on what has been. They think the past was better than the present. But as Christians we look to the future. We believe that there will be a future fulfillment, that the promises which have been given to us by God are not yet finished, that there is more to come. But what about atheism? You see, how does it work for them? We know from scientific study that the world is coming to an end. Energy is gradually declining. One day the sun will burn itself out, it will finish, it will cease to exist. And then what? Now it may take a very long time. I realize this. That scientists say, well, it will be in 5 billion years or something. But whether it's in 5 billion years or whether it's tomorrow, the basic principle seems to me to be the same. There is an end. It's not forever. So if there is an end, is our existence completely meaningless? Because if I were to live for 5 billion years, if I were to live until the end of time, what benefit would I get from that? If I thought that I could improve life for my children and for the next generations, what would the point of that be? Why would I want to make life better and better for individual people when I know that the universe as a whole is actually getting worse and worse, or at least is getting weaker and weaker, that it is coming to an end? It doesn't make sense. Why would I plan for the future if there is no future? You see, if there's nothing to look forward to, ultimately, why bother? You see, what am I doing? What is the purpose of my existence? Also, is it really possible to improve the human race? I would want to argue that even atheists are beginning to question this. Do people get better as time goes on? Actually, they don't. There is no evidence to say that the next generation will be an improvement on the present generation. Now, in some very limited ways, there may be some truth in this. For example, it may well be true that the next generation to live on Earth will be against carbon emissions, that they will want to conserve energy, that they will not be using oil and gasoline in the way that we are now. And of course that would be a good thing, if that is true, conserving the resources of the planet. All right. And the younger generation may be better educated in this way and may feel this more passionately. But does that make them as individuals better than we are? I don't think so. Because the next generation will find that although they may make improvements in this respect, in one way, other problems will come up. Other things will intervene. We're discovering this at the moment. It's very interesting that for the first time in my life, certainly, the world in which I live has come to a stop. Has come to a stop because of pandemic, because of coronavirus, these things coming into our life. And suddenly all the things that we planned, all the things that we took for granted, all the things that we imagined would happen automatically have just either disappeared or they've stopped. We don't know. And people are saying to themselves, where do we go from here? You see, we may cure this virus. We may solve this problem. But when's the next one going to come? You see, people warn us. They say that this is only the beginning. There's climate change. The world is getting warmer. What are we going to do? When large cities start to flood, and so on. Are people going to look out for their neighbors? Are they going to care about other places, other people, and so on? Or are they going to look out for themselves? Are they simply going to say, well, I need to survive, never mind what happens to somebody else? I suspect that the desire for self-survival, for me to survive, is going to be much stronger than the desire to help others. I don't think the human race has got any better than that. Now, another thing that is happening that we see is that many atheists realize that they are too dogmatic, that they have too easy a solution to problems that are in fact much more complicated than they have been prepared to recognize. So they abandon atheism in the strict sense, and they become instead agnostics. They instead of saying, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe there is a God, they will say, I don't know, I'm not sure. Maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't a God. How can I know? This has the appearance of humility, intellectual humility. And compared to a dogmatic atheist, that is a fair enough assumption. They are being intellectually humble, yes. But at the same time, they are also being intellectually lazy. Because if you don't know whether there is a God or not, and you are not really concerned about this, you leave the question to one side, you don't discuss it, you don't deal with it, you are, practically speaking, an atheist. Because even though you claim not to know for sure, you are acting in a way that assumes that no God exists, you see, because you are agnostic. This, in effect, means that you are avoiding the hard questions of life. You are saying, well, this is too great, this is too big, this is something I cannot resolve. And the problem of this is that the indifference which this creates, you see, is actually worse than hardline atheism. Because, as I said in the first part of my lecture, very often a hardline atheist, a strong atheist, is someone who is angry at the state of the world, They want to go out and change it. They blame religious people for not having done this. But an agnostic who doesn't know one way or the other probably has no motivation to do anything. We don't know. So we just let it be. You see, they are not people motivated by anger, motivated by a desire to change. And therefore, although they claim to be humble intellectually, they could be further away from God than a pure atheist is. Because a pure atheist has to focus on what he doesn't want, on what he doesn't believe. Whereas the agnostic just goes away and ignores the whole thing altogether. Atheism in any form has no answer to death. This is the ultimate problem, the ultimate question. Why do people die? What lies behind the grave? When I am young, I think I'm going to live forever. I think building for the future, building for my own future, makes some kind of sense. But as I get older, I am more concerned just with surviving. I think, well, every day is a blessing. Every day is something more than I have a right to expect. How long will it go on? I don't know. You see, I look at myself now and I think of my future and I say, well, how much more time have I got? Of course, nobody knows the answer to that question. All of us could die anytime. We don't know. But assuming the normal pattern of human life, maybe I have another 20 years to live, perhaps. 30 years, very unlikely, but you never know, it's possible. 40 years, no. I will not live another generation, this I know. Unless some miracle drug is discovered, this is not going to happen. And when I see people who are extremely old, I'm not sure that I want it to happen. I mean, do I really want to spend years confined to my bed because I can't move? I'm still alive, but I'm so old and so unable to do anything that my life no longer serves any meaningful purpose, at least so it would appear on the surface. Is this what I want? Well, no. And yet, at the same time, I think life is valuable. I think life is a good thing. I think life is a gift from God. I don't want my life to end, and I'm not going to end it myself, although I can. I mean, I have the power to end my life if I wish to do so, but I'm not going to exercise that power because it will be destructive. I don't want that. I want to go on living. I can't say that I regret getting older particularly, because there are good things about getting older, as well as things which are not so nice. But having said that, usually having got to that, I say to myself, well, for how long? You see, I might keep it up for 10 years, I might keep it up for 15 years, 20 years, but why am I doing this? You see, where am I going? Now, as a Christian, I know, of course, that every day is one step nearer to life with God in eternity. I am preparing for eternal life. I'm in if I could put it this way, I'm packing my bags for a journey without end, for a transformation into a new life. There is a purpose in my life, and the older I get, the more focused that purpose becomes, the more complete it becomes, the more it takes over my life, and I concentrate on that more rather than anything else. But if I don't have a goal, if I don't have a purpose in life, why would I do these things? You see, what would my interest be? And so I say that from the Christian point of view, atheism is extremely sad. It is a very unhappy kind of life, because you can struggle for years to achieve something, but in the end there is no reason for doing this. Atheists must be judged, I think, according to the principles laid down by the Apostle Paul in his great letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians at the end of chapter 13, the great passage about love. And there Paul says there are three main principles in life. There is faith, there is hope, and there is love. The atheist has no faith. There's no reason to have faith. There's no object for faith. Because the atheist has no faith, the atheist has no real hope. What is there to hope for? How do we know that it might happen? We know that something will change, something will happen, yes, but we might be fear might be just as valid a reaction as hope. Why hope? When we see things. The older we get, if we have that view to start off with, we may when we are young, but the older we get, we find that our hopes are disappointed. And when hopes are disappointed, despair sets in. Older people, if they have no faith, you see, can be people who are very, very cynical, and they despair because there's nothing, no foundation for their existence, no way of deciding why they should stay alive. And of course, finally, the whole question of love. And this is where it all comes down in the end. As an atheist, I might be able to insist that the world is going in a certain direction, and I may try to force it to go in that direction. Would I be doing this out of love? No. I'd be doing this out of necessity. I'd be doing this because this is built into the system. There is no other alternative. But love is bigger than this. Love cannot be contained by the limits of material reality. Love is a relationship. Love is a relationship to other people, yes. It is a relationship to the created order, yes. But it is primarily a relationship with God. And it is because I love God, and because God loves me and puts his love in me, that I have the power and the motivation and the will to love other people, to love the people whom he has made, whom he has created in his image and likeness, and that I have the love to love the created order, the trees, the plants, the world in general is a gift, and I love it because it is a gift from God. So for me, belief in God, belief in the God who became a man in Jesus Christ, gives me faith, it gives me hope, and it gives me love. And this is what I think Christians bear witness to. It is what Christians believe. It is what Christians put into practice in their life. And when we look and compare this with atheism, we realize that we are actually very rich and very fulfilled people. We are not going to be disappointed. We are not going to fail. Because in the end, when the end comes, when death comes, we will move to a higher life, to a better life, to an eternal life with God. Well, I've come to the end of this series of lectures. We've talked in different ways about what is wrong with the world and about the various solutions which people have proposed. And I leave you with this thought, that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. If you want to know the truth and you want to have life, turn to him, because Jesus Christ is the only one who can give you what your heart most clearly desires. And so on that note, I leave you and hope to see you again at some future time. Thank you very much.